Imagine all of the UK's £1,122.8 billion of tax revenue per year is represented as £100 of your tax money. How is that £100 actually being spent? This video aims to be as accurate as possible. However, data for the 25 to 26 financial year has not yet been released, so that being presented is from 2024 to 2025, though it will likely very closely reflect how taxes are currently being spent. The largest slice of this tax pie is spent on welfare. Of your £100 of tax, £21.30 is allocated to the welfare system. This is a massive portion. Over a fifth of taxes feed into this, but that makes sense. The welfare system contributes so much. It finances anything from universal credit, income support, support for sick and disabled individuals, all the way to things like elderly housing, child and family support, housing benefits, and child protection services. Even the smallest things like winter fuel and job seeker allowances are supported by these 21 odd pounds. However, welfare being such a massive portion of people's taxes, literally the largest, does often rub people the wrong way, mainly as they feel that they barely, if at all, benefit from it. Alas, evidence shows that over half of the UK population benefit more from the welfare system than what they contribute. So it's not a minuscule 5% of the population that reaps all the benefits like some people fear. The next largest slice of the pie is distributed towards health, consuming £20.90 of every 100. These two, health and welfare, are by far the largest chunks of total tax revenue. Together, they take up over £42. The next largest expense is barely a quarter of this. The expenditure on health covers a few things, but overwhelmingly the NHS, which represents 94% or £19.65 of the total health budget. The rest is spent on other public health and social care services. Accounting for £11.90 is state pensions. Carried with this again is the notion that people do not benefit from pensions even close to what they have contributed. While that may be the case for future generations, in the current day, the reality is that almost everyone benefits from the state pension system more than what they have contributed. In fourth place, accounting for £10.80 per 100 of tax, is national debt. This is essentially all the interest repayments that the UK pays to domestic and international investors. Around 40% of UK public debt is owed to UK-based investors. This is things like pension funds, insurance companies, and commercial banks. A further 30% is owed to overseas investors. So that's again banks, but also investment funds and in foreign governments. The remaining 30% is owed to the Bank of England, which is quite confusing because it's completely owned by the government. So the UK essentially owes and pays itself money. £10 is a crazy amount. Okay, crazy amount is subjective. Compared to a country like Egypt that pays almost 70% of total tax revenue on interest repayments of its debt, it may not seem like much, but for the UK, a developed country, 10% is a massive burden. Essentially, 10 of your £100 contributes nothing to society and benefits you in no way. Don't get me wrong, debt is very necessary, especially in crises, but the more that's spent on it all the time means that less is spread across other key services. Education represents £10.30, while defence represents half that, around £5.50. A big misconception around tax dedicated defence is, firstly, that the defence budget is much larger than it actually is, some people believing that it's 15, 20, or even 30% of the total budget, but also that the vast majority of the defence budget is actively funding the war in Ukraine, which is again another exaggerated misconception. The total financial support the UK has provided to Ukraine for the war per year only represents 26 pence. Here you can see exactly how much that is. And as far as education goes, this budget funds everything you expect it would. £4.40 are spent on public order and safety. A bit of a convoluted name, but in layman's terms, it's everything to do with police, counter-terrorism, courts, prosecution services, on top of all prisons and rehabilitation programs, plus all fire and rescue services. Even the funding for the UK's visa, immigration and border services fall under this category. A further £4 is spent towards transport. Of this £4, around half so £2, is spent on railways and trains, another 60p on local roads, 60 on national roads and motorways, 40p is spent on local public transport, so that's 30 on buses and 10 on trams, and only 2p is spent on cycling and walking infrastructure. Obviously, it's important to note that this is the average across the nation and varies greatly across regions. The tiny remainder of the transport budget is spent on aviation and maritime regulation at just a penny, plus electric vehicle incentives and charging infrastructure, which is literally even less than a penny. Okay, now we're getting into the really small stuff. £3.50 are allocated for economic affairs. Under this category, you've got fuel and energy, which is green energy like wind farms, solar and nuclear. You've also got the national grid and bill support. So that's anything like energy price caps and guarantees. Next, there's general economic and labour affairs. Think things like employment help, business support and market regulations. There's also science and tech. That can be research and development, so funding for university research and tech grants, as well as infrastructure like laboratories. Next, there's agriculture, forestry and fishing. This includes farming subsidies, forest management, and of course fisheries. And finally, there's mining, manufacturing and construction. Our next slice accounts for £2, and that is spent on something called government administration. This is essentially the core departments and functions that are required to run the country. The day-to-day running of central and local government departments, civil service, tax collection, HMRC, you name it. These £2 also finance all international embassies and representations. Another £1.90 was spent on housing and community amenities. So basically any housing, subsidies and grants, the cost for maintenance of council homes, plus the upkeep and development of public spaces, so like parks, streetlights, public toilets, all that, as well as community facilities like town halls and playgrounds. £1.50 of £100 is not much at all, but that's exactly the amount that funds all of environmental protection in the UK. This covers EV networks, environment and water protection agencies, clean energy schemes, sustainable agriculture and farming incentives, as well as nature recovery projects, wastewater management and waste reduction subsidies. Absolutely anything to do with the environment and protecting it comes from this £1.50. Culture, recreation and religion accounts for £1.30 of the larger £100. This is all museums, galleries, art councils, libraries, and all ongoing preservation of monuments and heritage sites. It also funds the BBC and other public medias. Public sports facilities, leisure centres, and government-run athletic programs, along with the maintenance of listed churches and places of worship, are also a product of these £130. Just over half that, around 70p, totalled all funding for overseas aid in 24/25. However, this year, that budget has been slashed to only 30p. While only a tiny fraction of the budget, these funds are intended to finance such a massive variety of causes and initiatives. The largest portion is spent on domestic refugees, specifically the food and accommodation required for their first year in the country. Anything past a year then comes out of the public order and safety budget. The next largest portion of the budget is on humanitarian aid. That's basically all funding to support those affected by conflicts, crises, and emergency disasters. Global health, like disease control and vaccine deliveries, also fall under this category, along with support for nations vulnerable to climate change and programs for developing nations to improve access to education and private sector growth. These 70, now 30p, go so much further in terms of penny-to-penny impact than anything else in the whole of the UK's tax budget, yet it is slowly being reduced to nothing. The final distinct piece of this pie, strangely enough, is outstanding payments to the EU, and this is a massive amount, representing a whole penny of every £100. This money is basically the UK's shared ownership of retired EU staff pensions. It was the UK's responsibility to pay 12.43% of EU pension costs, as negotiated when they left the Union. It's a very small amount, but it will continue to be paid until 2065, when the remaining EU staff members who are working during the UK's membership in the Union pass away. So, we've finally reached the end of the budget. However, there is one more topic that I would be remiss not to mention. It has become increasingly overstated in recent years, particularly by the far right, and it is the level of public funding spent on asylum seekers and immigrants. This topic receives so much political and media attention. It is presented as the UK's black hole of spending, leading some people to assume that funding must be 10, 20, even £30 of every 100 people are taxed. It's no wonder people think it's the primary cause of funding shortages in other services. If only the money was spent on its own people, on more important services like the NHS, the country wouldn't be in the dilemma it is now. That's the opinion of many, and fair enough, because that's the narrative that's constantly being pushed. But that's just not the case. You can clearly see this pie is completely full. Where is this 10 or 20+%? Now, I'm not going to lie, there's no doubt there are many expenses related to refugees and asylum seekers. Foremost, there's accommodation, hotels, former military barracks, other repurposed sites, and long-term self-catering accommodation. Plus, you've got administration services, legal processing, and any cash allowances and other subsistence support. But even with all that, in the broader picture, the cost to the UK taxpayer is comparatively nothing. Literally 33 pence. Let's put that into perspective. As stated, it's a popular proposition to use the money spent on asylum seekers to better fund something like the NHS or other health and welfare services. Here you can see the funds spent on asylum seekers is literally 60 times smaller than the NHS, and even better, it's 128 times smaller than the larger combined health and welfare budgets. I mean, what is 33 pence going to do? Alternatively, the cost to build a British dreadnought submarine and run it for just a year is roughly 9 to 10 billion pounds, of which they are currently building 4. 9 to 10 billion pounds is double the annual cost of support for asylum seekers. So if you want to improve the NHS, build one less submarine, and you will have doubled the amount you will have saved from demolishing the asylum seeker budget.